lots of, particularly the families, are quite disappointed. But it's not that easy.
Embassy of India in Kathmandu and BP Koila and the Nepal Foundation warmly welcomes you all to this 22nd edition of Conversations. In this edition of Conversations, we have with us Aditya Adhikari, a noted writer, analyst, columnist, who have been vigorously writing about the contemporary issues of Nepal. He has been consistently writing about the political transitions in Nepal, the political tensions, even on social issues and more, in various newspapers, journals, blogs, and magazines. Can we have a big round of applause for Aditya Adhikari? Today we will hear him talk about his well-received volume, The Bullet and the Ballot Box, the story of Nepal's Maoist revolution. Another ordered author in Nepal, Thomas Bell, who writes about Nepal for The Economist and other publications, who spent many years in Nepal, understood the thick and thin of Kathmandu, and authored the book Kathmandu, will moderate today's talk. Can we have a big round of applause for author Thomas Bell? You will introduce Aditya Adhikari's The Bullet and the Ballot Box and will raise questions to the author. The interaction between them will take for approximately 45 minutes, after which we will open the floor for further discussions. Over to you, Thomas.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity yet to read Aditya's book, which was only launched here a couple of weeks ago, I guess. And of course, it's not the first book about the Maoists. It's the latest of many, but in my opinion, by far the best. Whereas there are so many books now which describe, what Prachanda tried to say to Gyanendra, this message that was passed, or this meeting in Delhi, and all of these kinds of things. This book really distinguishes itself, I think, in attempting to describe the experiences of ordinary Maoist cadres. There's a lot of discussion in there of the novels they read, and what these stories meant to them, their diaries and memoirs and so on. So it's a much more rounded and elegant, enjoyable. If you were to read one book on the Maoists, I would heartily recommend it. With there being so many books on the Maoists already this year, and presumably many more to come, what made you want to go to the considerable trouble of adding your own? I mean, it's a lot of work, obviously.
Well, I mean, there have been many books on the Maoists, you're right. But there isn't, when I started thinking about writing a book on the Maoists, I thought that there wasn't really a comprehensive volume which dealt with all aspects of the Maoist movement. And I thought that I should probably try to write one. The ones that had been published were either published during the war itself, and those dealt primarily with high-level politics. Then there have been a couple of volumes, mostly put together by anthropologists or some other social scientists, which deal most with various facets of the movement, but do not provide a comprehensive view of the movement as a whole. So I thought that there was really a need. I mean, it's been almost 10 years since the war ended. When I started thinking about the book, it was only about 3 or 4 years since the war ended, probably 4 or 5 years. And I also thought that the time was ripe to look at the war, the civil conflict, with some distance, to provide a more historical view. It seemed to me that everything else that emerged at that time were either journalistic or written in the heat of the movement, or there were some anthropologists who'd done some social science work. But I thought that a sufficient period of time had lapsed, kind of to give a more dispassionate account of what had happened during those 10 years of history. Having said that, I would not have written the book had it not been for a set of factors. I first, I started reporting about the Maoists in 2008, or slightly before that, when they had come above ground and when kind of their leaders had become accessible. And I was meeting them and interviewing them, and I was writing about them in the papers. But at that time, the idea of writing a book had not really struck me. But then sometime in 2009, 2010, I started finding all these writings by Maoists themselves. And these were works written by people in the middle or lower ranks of the movement. And there were many kind of, very ideological works, which were interesting to a certain degree, but the works that really caught my attention were the works which provide a more personal view of the Maoist conflict. There were letters, diaries, memoirs. You know, I mean, there were kind of many combatants or party people who kind of had published their verbatim diaries from the war. And because I was interested in the experience of the war, I started reading these. And there was a lot of, I mean, there was a lot to sift through. I mean, they were kind of raw. They were almost like raw material in a way. I mean, kind of, you know, they weren't properly edited or anything. But for a person like me who was interested, there was a lot of fascinating material there. So I thought that I should try to do a book on the Maoists which would be different from perhaps other books on the Maoists, in that it will look primarily at the conflict through the eyes of the people who were involved directly in the conflict, and not just their own, not just what they did as members of the party, like, you know, while on the battlefield, for example, but their inner lives. I wanted to explore their inner lives, the conflicts, the social conflicts that they had, the private conflicts that they had in their own minds, the reasons that led them to join the movement. And I thought that I could approach the history that I wanted to write in a more literary kind of way. I thought that using personal experience would allow me to kind of be slightly more literary in my approach. So these are the broad reasons why I decided to write a book about the movement.
Did your views about the Maoists change in the course of this process? How did your views about the Maoists change from when you first thought of them as a young man in the country where all this was taking place, through becoming a specialist and an author on the subject?
My views on the Maoists changed a lot. I mean, over the years that I was, I mean, I was working on them for a period of time, but, you know, as with everyone else in this room, everyone who lives here or is stayed with Nepal, the Maoists had a very direct impact on our lives, you know. Like everyone else in this room, I mean, I was, you know, totally surprised. I mean, I was shocked when the Maoists took off the way that it did. I was a teenager in the mid-90s when I heard that there was a Maoist movement. I thought it was something that was absurd, which I thought it was something that had become completely obsolete in the rest of the world. Like, you were some people, it had just been a few years since multi-party democracy was re-established in the country. I thought that a group like this could not have any legitimacy. I thought what they were doing was wrong. I mean, that's true. And I thought, when the Home Minister or other government officials said that they would go and crush the Maoists within a matter of weeks or months, I thought that was what would happen. I mean, I never thought they would get very far at all. But they spread, the movement spread, and to my great shock. And even by 2001, 2002, even by 2003, I mean, I realized how big they'd become, but I still thought there was no chance that they would be able to kind of gain power, they would be able to come to Kathmandu and gain power the way that they did. And as most other people who kind of grew up in Kathmandu in the 1990s, I was a liberal. I mean, I was what many people in Kathmandu would call Democrat, not necessarily aligning myself with the Nepali Congress Party at that time, but basically I thought liberalism was where the truth was at, and communism was a massive failure. But it was only after the Maoists came above ground and I started meeting their leaders and I started meeting people who were close to them. By this time I had developed a very deep fascination. I mean, I had seen that, okay, here was a big movement. What were the reasons why it became so powerful? And I've gradually grown to see that the social and political aspect of the movement. So, okay, so here, it's not just that these are a bunch of guys who took over territory and were violent and, intimidate people into supporting them. But they had a social platform which attracted a large number of people. They had a political strategy which was successful to a certain degree. It was clearly a thought-out strategy which had brought them a certain distance. So I started realizing this only in 2000, after the Maoists came above ground, I would say. And after that, I would say that, I mean, I didn't become a communist. I mean, I'm still a liberal at heart. But it kind of revealed two things to me. It showed to me that there was a real social basis to the Maoists and what they did. And secondly, it also showed to me the failures of liberalism as it was practiced in Nepal. through the 1990s. It became apparent to me over a period of time that the Maoists had come so far because liberalism as practiced in Nepal had failed. And this might be a failure partially of the way it was practiced in Nepal, and also it might be a failure of liberalism more generally. So these were the ways in which my views on the Maoists are going.
I thought it might be interesting to talk through some of the material that you cover in the book, especially for those who haven't read it yet. And one of the first parts which I found particularly interesting and which I wasn't especially familiar with was your description of the first threads of Maoism in Nepal in the 60s and 70s. The Maoists that we know today are very far from being the first Maoists in the country, of course, and the first Maoist movement, or an early violent Maoist movement, was conducted by what became the UML, of course, the Jabba movement, in which several landlords were killed. What is the early history of Maoism, or sort of the pre-history of the contemporary Maoist movement in Nepal? And how does it happen? Excuse me. How does it happen that one set of heirs to that movement becomes the UML that we have today, and another was launching a violent movement 20 years ago?
I deal with the prehistory of the movement, not in very much detail. I mean, somewhat perfunctorily. But there are a number of things here. I mean, it's well known that in Nepal that the influence of the Naxalites. That the Naxalites in India had a major influence on young people in Nepal. It's also well known that the Cultural Revolution had a big impact on Nepal. But one incident which I found quite fascinating, and which I start my book with, which I thought the people wouldn't remember now. I mean, when you talk to older people, it's part of history, but there was a phase when the Chinese in the late 60s, during the Cultural Revolution, were sending Chinese people to supervise road construction in the Sindhu Palcho district, for example. And at that time there was a conflict because there was China itself, there was such fervor kind of during the Cultural Revolution, and it had a spillover impact in Nepal, where basically the government accused the Chinese supervisors at the camps of making the Nepali workers stand in front of Mao's portrait and salute it before they were paid, making them attend cultural programs in which Maoism was extolled. And there was an interesting incident. I mean, it was an interesting diplomatic incident at that time, where there was the Cultural Revolution threatened diplomatic relations, that Nepal's diplomatic relations with India and America. There was an incident where an Indian diplomat was, or a Chinese diplomat was expelled from Delhi, I think. Do I remember that correctly? Was it But a Chinese diplomat was expelled from Delhi, and on his way back to Beijing, there was a big crowd of Chinese people who gathered at the airport, and they shouted slogans against India, and they, kind of chased journalists and beat some journalists, and there was a big diplomatic incident. The Indians complained to the Nepali government. There was another similar incident in which the Americans complained to the Nepali government. And there were kind of some young Nepali people who were kind of involved on the pro-Nepali side, and there were some Nepali people involved on the pro-India side, or the pro-monarch side. And a slightly other related incident, as a fallout of this and other similar incidents, there were clashes in Kathmandu between kind of royalist supporters and Maoist supporters, and the Chinese bookstore in Motaiti was kind of raided.
This in the 70s or something?
This was in 1967, I think, 67, 68. That is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, this is a more precise, the evolution of the Maoist movement in Nepal. So you always had a number of trends, kind of many splits, fractures, tendencies in the Maoist movement. The biggest trend, the biggest faction was what later became the UML, the Maoists who came out of the Japa movement, and the CPN-ML and the CPNM, the Marxist and the Marxist-Leninist. These two parties, later, by the 80s, due to their failures at kind of class struggle in the countryside, they kind of moved to Kathmandu. They had decided, gradually it was becoming evident that the Soviet Union was collapsing. But even before this, they had said that, okay, our efforts in the countryside have failed. Now what we need to do is we need to focus our efforts in the cities. And this was after 1980, after the referendum, this happened very substantially. And so their base started becoming students, their base started becoming trade union people in Kathmandu. And through this process, they gradually became more urban-centric, and they gradually started adopting liberal democracy as a model. You know, and this was the main tendency of Nepali Maoists. On the other hand, the more minor tendency, you know, which comes through Mohan Bikram Singh, and then Kiran, then Pachanda, through, you know, Patlo Masal first and Moto Masal, is this kind of effort to stick to Maoism, to authentic Maoism, you know. And it's interesting because through the 80s, this was a minor party, but they made, going back, their emphasis was always on armed struggle. It was always a nucleus, you know. Unlike the parties that later became the UML, they didn't really make much of an effort to kind of come to urban areas or to kind of create mass organizations. Their emphasis was, okay, we're going to remain small. We're going to have a nucleus of committed people, like a vanguard. And we're going to train ourselves. We're going to study guerrilla tactics. And if the opportunity presents itself, we're going to gather weapons and practice guerrilla warfare. So this was the aim through the late 80s. And the People's Movement took everyone by surprise, which kind of forced the Maoists to kind of take a parliamentary term through the early 1990s. But you know, this was the kind of other tendency in the Maoism during that time.
We better skip on a bit because time is relatively short.
Yeah.
One of the distinguishing features of the Maoist movement as it emerged after 1996 during the conflict was the role of women. Quite a high proportion of party cadre, including in the PLA, were women. What can be said about the impact of this on the women's movement in Nepal? Is it too soon to say? Did they achieve long-term gains? And indeed, what's happened to the individuals concerned? You hear stories about them going back to the village where they're rejected socially and so on, or having difficulty fitting in, more difficulty than their male comrades fitting in since the war's ended. What can be said of the impact of the war for women?
I'll answer your question, but before that, maybe I'll say a few words about the role of women in the Maoist movement itself, like during the years of the war, and then I can come to like the situation, the impact that it has had. It's very commonplace now. You know, it's very commonplace now. Everyone says that the Maoists women joined the Maoist movement in very large numbers. At one point, maybe over 40% or even 50% of the army were women. It is said. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but a large number of women combatants were women. And in the party too, there were a substantial number of women. Not at the highest levels, but at the intermediate levels. You know, there were a number of different reasons why women joined. I mean, one out of a kind of, you know, an independent kind of decision in which they saw a greater freedom. But I think there were a lot of push factors in that a lot of women who came from slightly marginalized positions, you know, people who, in my book I give an example of a woman who joins the Maoist movement. So I explore this novel written by this young woman Maoist, in which there's a woman who's middle class, or rural middle class, so not urban middle class, so lower middle class, let's say, who joins the movement because she's forced to kind of marry someone she doesn't like. But this is just an example, like, you know, people who are widows, for example, or people who have poor relations in their families, or who can't stay in their families for whatever reason, who feel oppressed within their household. They joined the Maoists in large numbers. When they joined the Maoists, they developed kind of a sense of freedom. This is also commonplace as well known, you know. Especially, many people joined the army, you know, the condition of women in the army wasn't very good. But if you had some skills, if you could sing or dance or write or give a speech, you could kind of gain positions of responsibility quite quickly. You would be kind of sent to areas, travel, sing, dance, give a revolutionary speech, try to attract people to the movement in the party. And that gave women a sense of confidence and, you know, a sense of freedom and a sense of, you know, of being, of empowerment. but that was not the whole story. I mean, there are a lot of women who joined the Maoists who came from extremely disempowered backgrounds, you know, and they would join the Maoists out of some kind of fear, or like, you know, and they would have a community within the Maoist movement. They might join the army or something. So very young girls, for example, and then they would be scared. They might not want to remain in the movement. They were under major restrictions, but often they stayed in the movement because they had nowhere else to go. And there are some very kind of pathetic, very sad stories about this kind of person who joined the Maoist movement also. Coming back to your question about the long-term effect of the Maoist movement, what I see is, you know, when you still travel across Nepal, there's a certain type of rural woman that you see who is able to talk, who is involved in local politics, and speaks in a certain way, looks you in the eye, and shakes your hand firmly. And I don't think that category of woman would have been in existence had it not been for the Maoist movement. Of course, you had an elite-led Maoist women's movement in Kathmandu, perhaps to a certain degree in rural towns. And in the Madhesh, you have some women leaders who have emerged since 2006. But I think this is a phenomenon that is directly a consequence of the communist movement. To a certain extent, also because of the UML's actions in the 70s and the 80s. There were older communist movement leaders who emerged through the UML. But more recently, of a younger generation, I think this is quite a substantial effect or impact on the communist society.
Along with the hardships faced by many women in the villages, identity and experiences of prejudice and exclusion and so on were another major reason that the Maoists were able to attract the support that they did among certain sections of the population. And this was a grievance which they deliberately addressed and tried to exploit, and was part of their policy during the war. What was the role of this in the Maoists' appeal, in their ability to expand their movement? How far did the agenda address this at that time? I mean, not in the constitution writing phase that we're in now, but at that time, and how genuinely part of their ideology was it?
I mean, as you know, the communists have had a really kind of conflicted history with issues regarding indigenous groups, or cleavages based on caste and ethnic lines. The UML, from very early on, it claimed to be purely focused on class, and it claimed that a focus on caste and ethnicity was retrogressive and would lead to let's say, and too much of a focus on such matters would lead back to kind of conflicts within society and communalism, that kind of thing. The Maoists, I mean, they developed their precise strategy regarding the ethnic and class groups relatively later, but they were always much more sympathetic towards this issue than people in the UML were. And when you go back and read party documents from the Masal days, when Mohan Vikram Singh was the leader of CPM Masal, there's a much greater sensitivity towards these issues. Partially, it might have to do with the fact that their core support base came from places like Rolparukum, where Muggers were predominant. But over a period of time, I mean, the Maoist leaders developed a kind of worldview in which they said that obviously class was primary, but caste and ethnicity were also necessary. And the way to justify this was by saying that inequalities in Nepali societies were, to a very large extent, determined by caste and ethnicity. So any movement to ameliorate inequality in society would have to take caste and ethnicity into account. And at that time, they would use Lenin as justification. They used to say Lenin too said that the oppressed groups, or the nationalities in Russia would have to be given a certain degree of autonomy before they could be fully assimilated into the broader nation. And that is what they followed, and they promised autonomous provinces for various groups during the war, as all of us know. The interesting, this is all kind of well known, this is all commonplace. I rehash it in my book. But the interesting thing for me is, like how the intersection between caste and ethnicity on the one hand and class on the other hand played out during the years of the war. It's one thing to say in theory, but in practice there are always contradictions involved. And I give the example, of Gopal Kirati, who is one of the most prominent leaders of the Janjati leaders in the Maoists today. But he only became a Maoist relatively late. He only formally joined the party, I think in 2003 or 2004. I think it was 2003. Before that, he had many years of conflictual relations with the Maoists. So sometimes he had his own group in the Eastern Hills fighting for autonomy, doing their own small arms struggle. Sometimes there would be tactical relations with the Maoists. Sometimes they would kind of say that, okay, we were together for a while. Then they would have fights, then they would separate, then they would beat each other up, sometimes kill each other. Then they would kind of ally again. And if you explore this relationship closely, you see the kind of complementarities as well as the conflicts between a kind of a class-based and an ethnic-based struggle, And eventually he comes around to the Maoists fully. I mean, that section of the end of the chapter, I describe how he internalizes the idea of, yes, ethnicity is important, but it is important not to be an ethnic chauvinist. Class is more important, and that's why only the Maoists are able to deal with the contradictions in society and not ethnic groups themselves. He comes around to this conclusion. So this was during the war. Over a period of time, what we have seen is, after the war, gradually the class-based analysis, the class-based strategy of the Maoists dissipated to a very great degree. They weren't able to kind of continue a class struggle. They had to return all the land that they had seized and distributed during the war. There was no real redistributive effort that they could engage in any longer. And by 2008, 2009, they had to ally with Madhesi groups, other Janjati groups, which are purely kind of ethnic or identity based. And so over a period of time, I mean, the Maoists too have kind of lost the class struggle aspect of it.
So these are the three primary areas of political difference, I guess, on which they've tried to build their appeal: gender, ethnicity, and class. And you would assume that class would be the greatest, being a Marxist movement, a Maoist movement, although took its place very much among these other ones, which are perhaps more specific national significance. And the question I'm building up to is how was it that they were able to, I guess the core question at the centre of your book, how was it that they were able to achieve this enormous expansion in their movement and bring the monarchy to its knees? I mean, unimaginable really until very close to the end of the war that they should be able to do that they should be able to capture large swathes of the country. There are various elements in it, presumably not just the bases of their appeal. I mean, there's the question of the quality of their leadership. They undoubtedly had some very able leaders, not just in Bagram and Prachanda, but at the military level too, some extremely energetic commanders. And then there's the weaknesses of the government. I mean, it was a sort of astonishing turn of events.
I mean, to a large extent, and this is well known also, I'll just very briefly go through this, is that they were lucky, I mean, to a certain degree. One, they were enabled by the terrain in Nepal, which allowed them to wage guerrilla warfare. But secondly, they were enabled by the really, really stupid mistakes that the state made, including Gyanendra's seizure of power. But this is all very well known, I don't want to get into this. Regarding the political and military aspect of it, I'll speak briefly about both. The political aspect, there are many different things involved, but one thing I would say is that one reason why the Maoists realized very early on, even before they started their movement, they saw the example of, they analyzed the case of Peru really well. And from the case of Peru, they saw two things. First, they saw that an excessive use of violence while imposing revolutionary governance in the rural areas had alienated the population.
Alienated them from the shining path.
Had alienated the shining path from the rural populations. And secondly, they saw that if a movement drags on unendingly, if a war goes on unendingly, then even in the base areas where people initially support you, eventually they will turn against you. They might support you for 5 years, they might support you for 10 years, but after that, if you're not able to make a transition, get into power, or do something else, then those people are going to start getting disillusioned, are going to start questioning the hardships that they're facing, and they're going to question the leadership, and they're going to turn against you. So for that, what needed to be done? And they also saw from Peru that the Peruvian, the Shining Path, was too focused on the military aspect, and this is a lesson that they take from the Indian Maoists too, I think. From the Indian Maoists and the Shining Path, they learned by focusing yourself too much on military means and not engaging in open politics, first of all, you lay yourself open to the accusation of being a purely terrorist group, and secondly, you close all other options. Because they recognize that taking over the urban areas is extremely difficult, and by military means alone they won't be able to accomplish it. So this kind of focus on political strategy, of dealing in open politics consistently from the very beginning, engaging with all political forces across the political spectrum to the degree that they could while underground, maintaining a massive propaganda presence, and kind of leaving the door up for negotiation. These were some of the basics of the Maoist movement, some of the fundamental principles that they had when it started, which enabled its kind of growth and kind of evolution in the way it happened. That is one aspect of it. The other aspect is the military aspect. I mean, and here I would rather talk about the weaknesses of the state. I mean, of course, when they start a movement, they started a kind of they started a military, Larakudals, it was called in the early days, very small platoons, hit and run operations done by people kind of, consisting of small squads consisting of 8 to 10 people. Gradually it expanded. Had the state gone in and crushed the movement at this very early phase in a targeted manner, they could have possibly stopped it.
They tried?
They tried, but only the police, the army didn't come in until 5 years later. I mean, there were all these blunders at Kathmandu, conflict between the government and the palace, or the police and the army, and all these confusions, like occasions where the army was supposed to go in but refused to do so. I mean, a lot of blunders committed on the state side, which I won't get into in detail here. The police going out kind of acting in a very arbitrary kind of way, a random kind of way, not targeted at all. These kinds of things. But later on, I mean, the army kind of failed too. I mean, one thing which I show in my book is, I use the case of the Battle of Beni, which was probably one of the largest battles of the war. It's certainly the most prominent, it's the most well-known battle, in which around 4,000 Maoists, they walk from Rukum district for over a week to Nagdi district to kind of attack an army barrack. And this is a massive operation. They're planning for months beforehand.
The army had no idea it was coming.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, it's, there were kind of caravans of mules and other animals transporting food and medicine, and possibly weapons from the border, like all the way up to Rolpa. Thousands of kind of combatants traveling from all across the country, walking to Rukum, then kind of receiving training there, then walking for a week. And the government and the army had no idea that this was happening. I mean, which reveals, I think, that they had basically no idea what was happening in the countryside. If they had failed to notice such a massive operation, I think this by itself speaks to some of the major failures of the army, or some of the major failures of the army.
I wanted to ask, was it a deliberate tactic of the Maoists to incite army or police atrocities against their would-be supporters as a way of strengthening their base?
I don't think it was a deliberate strategy, but the Maoists did act in irresponsible ways on occasion. Like, for example, it was, so it wasn't that they wanted to see people get killed. that they deliberately kind of made the army attack some of their supporters or kill a group of villagers or anything like that. It wasn't kind of that Machiavellian in my opinion. But what did happen was they were very irresponsible in some ways in which they knew that the army was staying next to a Tharu village in, let's say, Nepal Ganj, for example. And they knew that the army was patrolling the area, but they'd still go to a Tharu village and demand food and shelter for the night, very well knowing that they were exposing people in that village to danger. You know, so I mean, and they would leave the next day in awareness that these people could possibly be targeted by the army.
Without rehearsing how the war ended in great detail, clearly they had this significant military success while keeping the political iron in the fire, and they were able to pivot into the peace process very successfully. I mean, it looks like brilliant leadership. Is that a large part of the basis for their success?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, you know, it's for the 10 years of the war, I would say that the leadership was very successful and the strategies and tactics worked really well. But if you see the history of the past 5 or 6 years, maybe their strategies haven't succeeded as well in peacetime. But I would have to say that, you know, to give the Maoist Party credit, the combination of Prachanda as the head of the Maoist Party and the army, and Baburam Bhattarai as the leader of the parallel government structure, and the chief strategist worked exceptionally well. They had a very complicated relationship, kind of, you know, conflictual at times, but it was a very complementary relationship where one person devised positions on, you know, on the ethnic issue or on revolutionary governance, and very importantly on the strategic issue of, you know, the demand for a constituent assembly, how to reach out to the parliamentary groups, why it was kind of, you know, convincing the party that it was better to ally with the parliamentary groups over the monarchy. And then on the other hand, the very charismatic leadership of Prachanda, who kind of, you know, convinced the party to, who implemented the strategy, as it were, you know, who kind of concentrated, kind of, who was able to convince a very large and diverse kind of leadership and cadre base.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and your book also describes the peace process. I mean, it's not the main focus of the book, but there's a section in there on that too, and obviously that's all, you know, very much in our minds this week and last week, and has been for years. The extraordinary thing that happened quite shortly after the war was that after exceeding all expectations during the war, the Maoists repeated the trick and won that first election. And we've now seen an equally spectacular collapse. What do you think accounts for their kind of hero to zero trajectory in democratic politics?
I mean, that's a complicated question. I mean, I don't have a deep answer to that, I guess. You know, I mean, there are a number of reasons, I guess. First is, they lost all leverage. You know, their leverage was the military, right? Once you enter mainstream politics, they maintain an army for a short period of time. It was only in 2012 that the PLA was dissolved, but really the PLA was lost as leverage many years before that. And once you lose that leverage, you don't really have anything to bargain with, you know. Secondly, the state structure in Kathmandu, there were new entrants to the game. The old state structure, the very entrenched state structure, was still the same. Everything was in place, the bureaucracy, the military. I mean, the older parliamentary parties, the Congress and the UML, they assimilate themselves to the kind of old structure very well, you know? You know, and if you can see, I mean, even though the Maoists performed well during the first election, everything that happened since then, I mean, they were forced to give up things very quickly. I mean, just the fact that Prachanda was forced to resign 9 months after he became, you know, Prime Minister, shows the extent to which, you know, there were entrenched forces against which the Maoists could not compete when in a situation where they had lost the military leverage. Continuing from that, you know, I mean, you know, I read an article by Kathmandu Sangrola yesterday, in which he identifies the 4 stages of the Maoist defeat, in which he calls the start of the counter-revolution, as it were, the 4 stages of the counter-revolution. First, the resignation of Prachanda in 2009. Second, the dissolution of the PLA. Third, the establishment of the Kilraj Regbi government. And fourth, the decision of Parliament the other day to kind of go ahead with the voting process, you know? So these are the 4 stages in the steady marginalization and undermining of the Maoist party. On the other hand, I mean, this is not to absolve the Maoists of flaws. I mean, their strategy and tactics too, I mean, it was not suited for peacetime. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, is that during the years of the war, the effort of the Maoists was purely focused on power. What they said, I mean, it's a part of Maoist doctrine that state power is everything and you can't do anything without state power. During the years of the war, they had a political program. They mobilized people, but they always told people, they said, today you support us, today we will fight, tomorrow when we come to power, we'll fulfill your promises. So it was always a power-oriented approach. After they came to Kathmandu, it was the same thing. Once we come to power, we will fulfill your promises. You know, and when they came to power, they said, but we're not really in power. We are a minority government. We need to get a majority. Our goal is total power. You know, so our goal is an expansion of power. So in this very Maoist-oriented mindset, they kind of failed to recognize that there were things they could do to keep their base happy. They failed to recognize that smaller ways in which they could engage the population or improve the livelihoods of people, you know, and things like this.
I was astonished that there was nothing about addressing the needs of migrant labourers in their election manifesto for last year's election. Isn't this the proletariat? But there's nothing there for them, and those people didn't vote for them.
Yeah, you bring up the migrant labour issue. I mean, I remember like during the Prachanda government, I was driving by, the passport office, the Naran building, which is now the Department of Foreign Affairs. There was a huge, I mean, for weeks on end, you would see hundreds and hundreds of people standing outside for, you know, hours and hours in the heat, waiting to get a passport to leave the town, to leave the country. Most of them came from rural areas. They could not get a passport, you know, at the CDU, local CDU office, so they had to make an expensive trip to Kathmandu and spend a week here or more just to get a passport. And which reminded me, which was like, you know, a Maoist government can't even provide people passports, which is like a basic necessity, you know? Which was an example for me.
What do you think accounts for the intractability of the peace process? I mean, at this late stage, the differences between the parties appear quite slight. I mean, the federalism issues narrow considerably to what appears to be a 6 or 7 state deal within sight. All of the other outstanding issues are simpler than that, probably. And yet there's this bitter polarization which carries considerable risks, not just for the country, but for the individual parties concerned if they miscalculate. It appears that, I mean, the NC and the UML are also pursuing a rather Maoist notion that state power is all and there's nothing else. Why can't they get this finished?
It's for a number of reasons, and it's been for different reasons over at different stages of the process. At this current moment, I mean, let's just talk about the problem now. The parties are relatively close to a deal, and we know that, you know, there was an agreement on almost all issues, except there was broad agreement on all issues except for what to do with 5 districts in the Taran. And the reason why there was not an agreement on these 5 districts were because very influential politicians have constituencies in this Chapamunam, Sunsari, and Pansanpur and Kailali. And influential politicians are not willing, politicians from the UML in particular and also the NC are not willing to kind of see these districts go to a Madeshi majority province. This is like the technical issue. More importantly, I think now what we have is a very dangerous situation where the government, the ruling parties, the UML and the NC have come together. They have a 2/3 majority almost. They have a 2/3 majority with the help of a couple of other small parties. And there is a kind of a sense of arrogance that they have won and that the opposition is lost, and that this is the time to push as hard as possible and try to undermine the other parties to whatever extent possible. They kind of think that the 2/3 majority that they got during the election is a mandate. It demonstrates that all the Maoist and Madeshi agendas have failed, which is not true. I mean, you can't link electoral agendas, electoral politics with long-term agendas in a similar way. They think, and combined with a certain arrogance of some senior party leaders, like KP Oli comes to mind primarily. I think he has played a very destructive and damaging role in the process.
Yeah. As you say, and I'm just going to throw you one last very brief question. As you say, the NC and the UML appear to have this feeling now that they have the boot on the throat of the opposition and that they can win this. And yet, looked at another way, the republic, secularism, federalism itself. There will be some form of federalism, presumably if there's a constitution at all. These are Maoist agendas. So you might say that they've carried the day, that what they fought for has been implemented. So my last question, and you don't have to take too long if you who's the big winner of the peace process? If you look at all the forces aligned, the army, the parties, the Maoists, who's come out of this on top?
I mean, agendas are different from people, right? I mean, the Maoists carry certain agendas. They fought battles on behalf of some people, and they carried they made a difference. I mean, but personally, they might lose power. They might not come back to. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Right now, certainly they're in a very poor position. And tomorrow, the people who continue continue the fight, might be different people. I mean, as individuals, they might lose. Who knows? But there are certain agendas that are carried over a period of time. I mean, I don't want to compare the Maoists with the Nepali Congress or BP, for example. I mean, they're very different kind of people, operating at very different periods of time. But BP, in his personal life, you might say he lost. He died a bitter man. I mean, he died with no power. He spent many years in jail. He was very sick. But at the end, I mean, he made a very lasting contribution in Nepal, which can't be taken away. I mean, I don't know. It's too early to say whether the Maoist contribution is equivalent even. But then it's just a parallel.
Well, there we are. That's our 45 minutes up, almost exactly. So I think there's about 10 minutes for questions.
We're now opening the floor for the question. Please raise your hands. I'll come with a microphone.
Thank you so much for the insightful conversation. Thank you for the both authors for coming so nice books in the history of Nepal. For you guys inspired us to read the book and get a lot of insightful view of our politics and a lot of things. And my question is like, Aditya, you have been so closely watching Maoists since long. So, as analyzing the timeline of the history, since 1990s till now, what do you see like Maoists as a successful thing or their failure till now? And that what were things, if they had been failed, then what were in the place of history that would be improved? If I think you know what I mean. The things that the four things Khaganos sir mentioned in his like the failures, but what would be the better things if they had? So thank you so much.
I mean, the thing with the Maoists, they brought many transformative things to Nepal. But those 10 years of the war were also very difficult. I mean, there was a lot of violence, a lot of fear psychology in people's minds, trauma. All these things are things we don't want repeated in our society, I think. I don't think we want a repeat of that. What I see is, in civil society, and this is something that I've thought about a little bit. When you look at civil society today, it's not the same civil society that existed during the 1990s. It's a different kind of in the 1990s, the civil society was very urban. It was purely, let's say, democratic. It believed like in pure human rights. People shouldn't get violated. People should have the opportunity to vote. This kind of thing. But no one really talked about issues about social justice or things like this, right? I think like since 2006, you've seen the growth of a different kind of civil society in all sectors, whether in the human rights movement, whether in the conflict victims movement, whether in the indigenous movement, which accepts the fact that yes, liberal democracy, the principles of liberal democracy of universal human rights is something important. But at the same time, we need to go beyond that. That there is such a thing called socio-economic rights which needs to be fought for. So this is a more complex position. And I think this deepening, this deepening of civil society It's both a widening and a deepening. Widening in the sense that people from different backgrounds are now part of civil society, and they have a deeper socioeconomic agenda. I think that might be a long-term consequence of the Maoist movement. So in that sense, it's a success. I mean, I don't know, about the Maoist movement itself, about their leaders, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But those are individuals. So who can say anything about individuals?
Okay, thank you for the talk, which was nicely delivered. Mr. You said how seizing of Rukum by March was possible, and the ignorance about the activities by army and the government. So, and also you said how Maoist movement is spread like wildfire in rural Nepal and failure since then. So, what is saying that? Sorry, can you elaborate this with some more other examples? And what do you think that Maoist activities was carried out only in rural part of western Nepal and eastern Nepal, and Kathmandu was almost untouched by the activity, and government became aware about it only after the major attacks in Tansin or some other places. So can you say on this?
The Tansin attack was very late. The Tansin attack was in 2005, and by this time it was after the 12-point agreement. It was right before the Jana Andolan. The attack that you were thinking about is in 2001, the Gorai attack in Dan. The attack in Gorai in Dan, the army barracks. Until then, the army was completely saying, we're not going to touch this. Until, they were saying that, until then, the army and the palace thought the Maoists can easily be contained if the army goes in. Let's just let the parliamentary parties and the police fight them for now. But then, after the collapse of the first ceasefire in 2001, the Maoists attacked the army base in Gorai, and that's when, after that, the state of emergency was imposed, and the army kind of went after the Maoists. And on your other question about, whether it was only in Western Nepal, initially it was only in Western Nepal, and their base area was always Rolpa, Rukum, these districts, and their surrounding districts. But over a period of time, they spread to most other parts of the country, to the eastern hills certainly, but Kathmandu, okay, yes, there were cells here, there was no revolutionary government here. But by 2004, 2003, 2004, many districts in the central region, like for example, if you would go to Lomjung or Tonahu or Kaski or Nawal Parasi, they're very close to Kathmandu. Yes, it was true the Maoists are relatively weak in the area. It was true that the army could penetrate these areas very easily. But if you kind of went slightly outside the district headquarters, even to a village, let's say 3 hours walk from any district headquarters, you would find that the government there didn't exist, and whatever government that did exist was a Maoist government. The authority was a Maoist authority, which is an example of, yes, which is this is slightly subtle. This is slightly complicated because the Maoists never had a permanent base area in any part of the country like the Chinese communists had in China. Meaning that in every part of the country where they existed, the army could penetrate. They were never, the army could always penetrate. But at the same time, even where the army could penetrate, in most areas across Nepal, including in areas very close to Kathmandu, in rural areas, the Maoists had managed to replace the government as the governing authority, which is as much a factor of the state being weak as the Maoists being strong.
Sir, my question is, in today's world, there is communism is fading away, and every country, starting point, Russia has disintegrated. So, in this context, can Maoists go with their agenda, or they must come to capitalism? That is my question. Yeah. And how, as you have studied mid-level and low cabinet, so what are their agendas? They go with the Maoist agenda or capitalist agenda in the long run.
we live in a capitalist world. I mean, I don't think communism is going to overthrow capitalism anytime soon. But that's not the issue, I mean, the Maoists, even during the war, they were never saying that they were kind of fighting to overthrow capitalism. They said maybe eventually, but what we're trying to establish is a transition to from feudalism to capitalism is what they said even during the war. But I mean, I think these terms are too broad to be of real analytical value in understanding what the Maoists accomplish or what their positions are. Of course, the world as it is, the international situation, Nepal being a very poor country, a peripheral country, there are significant limits to what a communist group in a country like ours can accomplish. They can never overthrow any kind of system. And it's like they can't even lead to a situation where they can be a closed-off, isolated society like Cuba, for example, or North Korea. I mean, very different societies. But just to give an example, and it's not even what they want to do. They have to engage. I mean, if Nepal closes itself off in such a manner, we'll kind of, not really be able to survive as a country probably. But I think, you have to look at the Maoist contribution, what they did with greater nuance, like not look at these big categories, but kind of, look at the changes that they affected within Nepali society itself, I think that is the better way to, that is what I try to do in the book too. I mean, I don't deal with very big, large issues. I try to show in detail or kind of, fine-grained kind of look at what actually happened and how they changed Nepali society. The other thing about young Maoist combatants is that, well, I mean, many of them are very disillusioned, especially previous kind of people who fought in the PLA, especially people who didn't manage to join the party and become a political player after the war ended. People who were consigned to cantonments, didn't have the political skills, had only military skills, and were disqualified, or they kind of were given, there were voluntary retirees who went back to their communities. There's very deep frustration among these people. They still, many of them still hold this old Maoist dream. But I mean, as all of us know, that there's great anger towards their leadership. They feel betrayed. They're kind of struggling to maintain their livelihoods in many cases. I mean, this is an unfortunate fact.
We have many distinctions in Nepal, including the highest mountain peak and birthplace of Buddha, and also a constituent assembly which was elected by the people to write a constitution which failed. And the second elections have taken place, and we are not sure if the constitution will be written or not. My particular question is, how important was external support in terms of 12-point accord brokered by India and INGOs mainly from such countries as Switzerland, Scandinavia and European Union. And now we have ambassadors of several Western countries meeting, seeking a route. And in many vernacular newspapers talk about the role of INGOs in Nepal supporting identity-related federalism, and British ambassador sending letters to constituent assembly members about the virtues of secularism. How important is the external support in the agenda of the Maoists to make it a success, in your opinion?
So I'll deal with your question in two parts. The first part about the war. There is an impression in Nepali society that among certain sections of the population. I mean, if you go to talk to people close to the army, for example, or even people in the main parliamentary parties, who say that the Maoists would have been nothing had it not been for full backing by the Indian government. And there's a section in Vivek Shah's book in which he claims that the Indians basically bankrolled and trained the Maoists. In my view, this is complete rubbish. I mean, it's a way of hiding. It's the way of people involved in the old Nepali state of hiding their own failures. Yes, it is true that the Maoists after 2003, the Indian security agencies were in touch with the Maoists after 2003. But I don't think it's true. There's no evidence that I have found that the Indians were basically kind of supporting the Maoists, or doing anything or kind of training them or giving them arms, or if anything, the Indians were giving the state a lot of weapons and money to go after the Maoists. Regarding the 12-point agreement, yes, it is true that India played an important role